It has been said that no two sisters were ever less alike. One reserved and proper, the other lively and controversial. One the anchor of a commonwealth of nations, the other a figure searching for purpose in life.
They grew up in a very, very different kind of world, a world of aristocracy, of deference, of people knowing their place.
I think they were quite different from an early age, and they went on being different.
I think they were both very sound people, both very committed in their different ways. I suppose that the Queen had so much more responsibility on her shoulders, and Princess Margaret didn't have those things to think about, so carved a different path through life.
Queen Elizabeth II and Princess Margaret are among the most photographed women in history. Their every appearance followed by press and public. They are familiar the world over. But what of the real women behind the show and splendor, beyond the balcony and cheering crowds, beyond the crown itself?
Elizabeth is really both an embodiment of the old England that she grew up in and the new, fast-changing modern world that she increasingly adapted to.
The Queen always thought of her sister as an enigma.
It's always very difficult to work out with Princess Margaret which half of her you're talking about, the royal half or the rather dashing half.
There's a huge affection between them that survives the ups and downs of their individual life.
The contrast between the sisters was there from the beginning. Elizabeth was born in the placid surroundings of London's Mayfair on the 21st of April, 1926. 4 years later, during a storm in rural Scotland, Margaret came into the world. Their parents were the Duke and Duchess of York, Albert and Elizabeth. Albert, or Bertie as he was known, was the second son of the King, George V. Elizabeth was a mature, rather serious child, with a love of dogs and horses shared with her grandfather, the King. Margaret, however, was a very different character.
It very quickly became obvious that Margaret was the cheekier, the more humorous, the more mischievous of the two girls. Elizabeth was certainly by no means plain, but lacked her sister's quite extrovert qualities.
Princess Elizabeth was quite a serious-minded child. She seems to have been naturally tidy, naturally orderly, but Margaret, from the start, was fun, she was vivacious.
She was never corrected by her father, so she was something of a wild child. She was very precocious and got away with an awful lot.
The Duke of York was used to say, "Lilibet is my pride and Margaret is my joy." And as far as Princess Margaret was concerned, he really couldn't take his eyes off this child. I mean, she was so beautiful that he couldn't believe that he'd created this glorious and beautiful child, and then he rather spoilt her.
The princess's public life began early, and here we see her during a Scottish holiday, arriving with a family party at a Highland gathering.
Neither girl was prepared for the lives they were to lead. As two daughters of a second-born prince, Elizabeth and Margaret had no expectations of being thrust into the international spotlight.
With the Duke and Duchess of York, there was never any anticipation that they would succeed to the throne, and certainly never any expectation that Princess Elizabeth would come to the throne.
It was, of course, always possible that George and Elizabeth would have further children, and a male heir would, of course, then leapfrog Elizabeth in line for the throne. So it was always a fairly remote possibility that she would become queen at her birth.
The Duke and Duchess of York, us four, as the Duke called them, rather anticipated a cosy family life in the way that they were already enjoying. And they were a very natural family and a very loving family.
It was the girl's uncle, the charming bachelor Prince David, who would be the next king. He was expected to marry and have children of his own, who would one day inherit the crown. Elizabeth and Margaret were set for a life of comfortable semi-obscurity. Until 1936, the year everything changed. Late on the 20th of January, King George V died at Sandringham.
He'd been unwell for quite some time, and it went back to the Great War, when he was thrown from his horse while reviewing troops in France and suffered from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and pleurisy. Now, that's a progressive condition, so it didn't get any better.
The only witness to the king's final moments in this regard were his physician, and his physician claims to have administered a lethal dose of morphine and cocaine to ease the king's passing, believing as he did in a gentle adoption of euthanasia.
It was also thought that it was far better that the king's death should be announced in the morning paper, the Times, rather than the slightly more down-market evening papers.
Elizabeth and Margaret's uncle David was proclaimed king and became Edward VIII. But the new monarch had never wanted the crown. Indeed, he was terrified by the idea. There was another complication. The king was in love with American divorcee Wallis Simpson and was set on marrying her. The wider British establishment, however, was far from taken with the idea.
Wallis Simpson was loose, irreverent, dashing, very much symbolised that kind of New World glamour, which endeared her very greatly to Edward, but did not endear her to the remainder of the family.
Wallis had been twice divorced, and that was unheard of in the British monarchy and in those social circles. And so that was a reason for not liking her.
He very much actually didn't really want to be king. He may not have even been able to voice that, but unless he was even stupider than I think he was, he must have realised that nobody was going to accept a woman as queen with two husbands living. That was the problem.
The secular head of state is also the supreme governor of the Church of England. He was about to go through a coronation ceremony that is very similar to the kind of consecration that a priest goes through. Anointed with holy oil, with water, it's a dedication.
For such a clear hypocritical breach to exist as him marrying a divorcee would, especially in the context of these times, have been wholly unacceptable.
I don't think he took at all well to being monarch. I think he didn't have the patience for it.
His own grasp of detail, particularly in regards to the empire, particularly in regards to the industrial disputes which were enveloping the country, really left quite a lot to be desired. Indeed, it is said that George V predicted, rather darkly, that if Edward became king, he'd ruin himself within a year.
A constitutional crisis was gripping Britain. The public were unaware, the press was muzzled, and the king's affair kept secret. Finally, unable to renounce the woman he loved, the king gave up his crown. On December the 11th, 1936, Edward abdicated. He had been king less than a year.
It was a shock. It was seen, I think, popularly as a dereliction of duty.
There were those who thought Edward should stay and should be allowed to marry Wallis Simpson, and there were those who just thought this man is a waste of space and he's got to go. And Wallis Simpson, let's say, saved the monarchy from a man who would have been a pretty awful king.
A crowd gathered outside Bertie's house in Piccadilly. The new king's family had moved out of their home into the vast and cold magnificence of Buckingham Palace. The lives of Elizabeth and Margaret were transformed. Elizabeth was now next in line to the throne. The training for her future role began at once.